On January 31st of 1906, a magnitude 8.8 earthquake struck off the coast of Ecuador near Esmeraldas. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, now in its second year from the Weather Network in Canada. Now, I have heard of some powerful Richter scale tallies when earthquakes are graded, but this one takes them all. An 8.8 would do severe damage to any city, but for a poor and vulnerable Ecuador and Colombia, this could have been the end of everything. This day in weather history. The 1906 Colombia-Ecuador earthquake induced both strong seismic motions and also a tsunami, the most destructive earthquake in the history of the Colombia-Ecuador subduction zone. As a matter of fact here, it is documented that some of the greatest earthquakes in the 20th century, not to mention the greatest present earthquake hazard in South America, they normally occur in Ecuador and Colombia, and it is attributed to the subduction of the Nazca Plate. The earthquake immediately triggered a destructive tsunami that claimed the souls of 500 people who were along the coast of Colombia. You see, the tsunami moved across the Pacific Ocean, and its waveforms were observed at tide gauge stations in countries including Panama, Japan, and the United States. And the tsunami was also recorded in Costa Rica, Panama, Mexico, California, and Japan. The tsunami did the vast amount of the damage and claimed the most lives. Of the push of the ocean onto shore, because that's what happens in a tsunami, the maximum recorded run-up height, that's the push or the force of water that comes up and takes over land, was 5 meters or 16 feet at Tumaco, Colombia. At Hilo, Hawaii, there was a 1.8 meter or almost 6 foot run-up height that was recorded for this event as well. The greatest damage from the tsunami occurred on the coast between Rio Verde, Ecuador, and Mique, Colombia. This, however, was not the only event of its kind that happened that century. Welcome to year 2 of this podcast. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider, but there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective, but oftentimes they will include visuals from that day's event from when it happened in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. 1906 was early, but rapid convergence at the Ecuador-Colombia Trench resulted in 4 more large earthquakes, all within 7.5 magnitude and all within the very same 20th century. But the 1906 earthquake and follow-up tsunami was considered the Great Earthquake, as it was a colossal magnitude and went on to rupture a 500-kilometer-long segment of that Ecuador-Colombia Trench. As mentioned earlier, there were 4 that century. The 3 since this one went on to re-rupture the same segment from south to north. The 3 played out this way. 1944 was the least intense along this subduction zone at a 7.6 magnitude. There was a 7.7 in 1958 and another real doozy, an 8.2 in 1979. Just consider that more pain over pain and further structurally destabilizing the region. In closing, the fairly regular sequence of seismic events in the 20th century along the subduction zone has been interpreted as one of the best examples of the seismic hazards in this area. So therefore, this is the only win I can find here. For science, it is a win, as it makes possible the unique and ideal region to study the crustal deformation associated with the earthquake cycle. So I'm going to guess that's good news from this day in weather history. Hey, do you like the podcast? We'd love to hear from you. If you have an idea, go right now to wherever you're listening to me and rate us if you would, please. It's on a 5-star system, and we would love as many stars as you can afford. So rate us, but then also review us. This way we can always stay on top of how you'd like to see the show evolve. Then remember to subscribe to this podcast. Click the subscribe or follow button right there on the very same podcast homepage you're listening on. You'll be immediately reminded that the next day is ready to listen to, and you also have access to every episode in the archives. It dates back to June 1st of 2020, so there is a lot that we got to get caught up on this day in weather history. Sadly, on February 1st, we are looking back as a memorial to those brave astronauts aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia who, after their mission in near-Earth orbit, were lost on re-entry. It is one of those chilling events where you always remember where exactly you were when it happened. I remember where I was, in the newsroom in a radio station that I was working for at that time. Look, space exploration is important to me, and it should be to all of us. It is not until we can step back from a scene when we can truly take stock of where we are and what we're up against. I firmly believe that space exploration is key to the survival of our species, and this was a dark, dark day for all of us. We will remember it tomorrow, on this day in weather history, with me, your host, Chris May.